I work as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada, spending my summers guiding kids through the wilderness, teaching them survival skills, and making sure they experience the joys of camping. On the night this happened, I was leading a group of 10-year-old boys on an overnight trip to a campsite across the lake from our main camp. It was a routine excursion. We paddled out in canoes, set up our tents, and let the kids swim, build forts, and play games, while my co-counselor, Mike, and I took turns supervising. We cooked dinner over the fire, roasted marshmallows, told stories, and soaked in the peaceful atmosphere of the woods. Around 9:30 p.m., I told the kids it was time to turn in. Their tents were pitched a short walk from the shoreline, still within our line of sight from the fire pit. Once they were settled, Mike and I stayed up by the water, enjoying the quiet, sharing a cigarette, and chatting about nothing in particular. Then, something happened that still haunts me to this day. As we sat there, gazing out over the inky black lake, a small light appeared in the distance. It moved slowly, hovering just above the water. At first, we dismissed it as a trick of the moonlight, or maybe a reflection from a distant cabin. But as it drew closer, we realized it was mounted on the front of a kayak. Someone was paddling toward our campsite. Now, part of our training as camp counselors includes handling stranger encounters, especially when we're responsible for kids on public land. I was prepared to give the usual speech, explaining that we were with a recognized camp and politely asking the paddler to find another site. But as the kayak drifted nearer, I felt an inexplicable chill crawl up my spine. The paddler was an elderly woman. Her gray hair was long and unkempt, trailing in the water as she moved. Her skin was weathered, cracked like old leather, and her eyes, sunken deep into her face, seemed lifeless. When she finally spoke, revealing a mouth mostly devoid of teeth, her voice was eerily soft, almost sing-song. "Are all your children safe in bed?" She gestured toward the tents. I froze. My mind struggled to process what she had just asked. Trying to mask my unease, I forced myself to answer. "Yes, they're fine. You need to leave." The woman smiled, a slow, unsettling grin. "That's good," she said, just as expected for this time. And without another word, she turned her kayak and glided silently back into the darkness. Mike and I sat there, speechless, watching the tiny light vanish across the water. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We were both deeply unsettled, not just by her corpse-like appearance, but by the way she had asked about the children, the phrasing, the knowing tone. We grabbed our hunting knives and checked on the kids. They were all fast asleep, blissfully unaware of what had just transpired. Not knowing what else to do, we stoked the fire and sat with our backs to the flames, watching the shoreline for any sign of movement. Then, about half an hour later, things got even worse. I got a text from a female counselor leading another group on the far side of the lake. Her message read, "Hey Sean, stop messing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really freaked out." A cold sensation crept up my spine. I immediately called her and explained what had just happened at our site. She went quiet, then told me what had just happened on her end. One of her campers had unzipped their tent to go to the bathroom and saw a woman standing at the shoreline. Her arms were outstretched. Her long, wet hair clung to her face. She was staring at their tents. Then, just as silently as she had come, she vanished. Neither of us slept that night. Ethan loved solo camping. He found peace in the isolation, in the way the wilderness swallowed the world whole, leaving only the crackle of a campfire and the whisper of wind through the trees. So, when he stumbled upon an unmarked trail deep in the mountains, one that didn't appear on any maps. He saw it as an adventure. The path led him to a clearing beside a still, black pond. The air smelled strange here, thick and damp, but the place was quiet, untouched, perfect. By dusk, he had a fire roaring. He sat by the flames, roasting a marshmallow, enjoying the way the sky melted into darkness. The forest was silent. No crickets, no owls. It was odd, but he brushed it off. Then, as he was about to take a bite of his marshmallow, he heard it, a whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the sound was too distinct, too deliberate. It came from behind him, slipping through the trees. Ethan, his breath hitched. He spun around, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the skeletal branches swaying in the dark. He shook himself. Maybe he was just tired. The mind played tricks in the dark, after all. But then, from the other side of the clearing, "Ethan, let me in." The whisper was closer now. A shiver crawled up his spine. He pointed his flashlight toward the trees, but the beam only reached so far before the darkness swallowed it whole. He forced a chuckle. "Okay, real funny. Whoever's out there, you got me." Silence. Then, footsteps. They were slow, crunching over fallen leaves, circling his campsite. Ethan's grip tightened around the flashlight. "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped just beyond the glow of his fire. He could feel something watching him. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they were gone. Ethan exhaled sharply. Maybe a deer had wandered too close. Maybe he was letting the isolation get to him. Still, he decided to sleep with his knife close. A few years ago, I loaded up my bicycle with camping gear and spent 7 months riding 5,300 miles, 8,500 kilometers, around the western United States, completely alone. Along the way, I had my share of eerie experiences, some unsettling in a very real, safety-concerned way, and others that were more along the lines of classic, spooky campfire tales. This story falls into the latter category. Exactly 2 months after leaving my home in Wisconsin, I reached Anacortes, Washington, a major milestone on my journey. It was the first time I had stood before the ocean on this trip. The salty air filled my lungs, though the view wasn't of the vast open sea, as the Olympic Peninsula and the San Juan Islands sat just across the Salish Sea. I decided to spend a week hopping between the 4 larger islands that had regular ferry service. The San Juan Islands are rugged, hilly, and sparsely populated, with an abundance of state parks and campgrounds. Early in my visit, I attempted to hike to the summit of Mount Constitution, the highest point in the islands, but the cold rain and howling wind forced me to turn back to my camp. After a few days of exploring the misty, rain-soaked islands, the weather finally cleared. Wanting to end my time in the San Juans on a high note, I returned to Orcas Island for one last adventure. That night, I biked from the ferry terminal to a campground under the cover of darkness, seeing nothing but the small stretch of road illuminated by my headlamp. I set up my tent, had a quick meal, and turned in for the night, planning to finally conquer Mount Constitution the next morning. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, another idea struck me. I looked up the next morning's sunrise time, set my alarm for 2 hours before dawn, and drifted off to sleep. At 4 a.m., I ate a quick breakfast in the dark and began my climb. A 5.3-mile, 8.5-kilometer, 2,070-foot, 631-meter ascent. And that's where things took an eerie turn. My headlamp's batteries were nearly dead, casting only a weak glow ahead of me. As I moved through the dense forest, I began to notice something unsettling. Pairs of glowing eyes, just beyond the tree line, watching me. Logically, I knew that any predators on this small, populated island were well documented. And yet, those thoughts did little to quiet the unease creeping up my spine. The eyes were always there, silent, unmoving, just beyond my reach. The rational side of my brain kept telling me it was nothing to fear. The rest of me wasn't so sure. I pressed on, determined to make it to the summit before sunrise. And when I finally did, all my apprehension melted away. The view was breathtaking. Mount Baker loomed in the eastern horizon, its snow-covered peak bathed in the soft, pastel glow of dawn. The sky turned shades of pink and purple, reflecting off the sea below. That morning, I also caught my first glimpse of Mount Rainier, a sight that would stick with me for the rest of my journey. It was the perfect way to end my time on the islands. The hike back down, now bathed in daylight, provided clarity in more ways than one. As I retraced my steps, I finally saw the figures behind those watching eyes. Just a whole herd of deer, exactly what my rational mind had tried to tell me all along, but in the eerie solitude of the pre-dawn forest that had been a much harder thought to believe. In 2021, my husband and I were camping at Boysen Reservoir in Wyoming. We got lucky and managed to secure a campsite right on the water, essentially a beachfront site. It was a perfect setup, with the only downside being that it was very isolated, far from the other campsites. At the time, the solitude seemed like a dream come true. But there's something unsettling about Wyoming's vastness. The desolation of the landscape, combined with the pitch-black nights, creates an eerie stillness that's hard to describe. Once the sun set, everything went dead silent, and the air felt unnaturally quiet. We set up camp and enjoyed a peaceful fire. But things took a strange turn shortly after, when an SUV with blacked-out windows appeared on our road, slowly driving toward our site. My husband, ever the friendly one, waved to them in case they were lost or needed help. But instead of stopping, they ignored us completely, continued down to the beach, stayed for about 5 minutes, then turned around and drove back the way they came. Something felt off. The entire situation gave us a bad vibe. My husband, sensing something wasn't right, told me to grab everything and throw it in the car. He kept shining a flashlight toward the beach, his instincts telling him that someone had been dropped off to watch us. We hurriedly packed everything up, got in the car, and drove off, trying to put as much distance between us and that SUV as possible. But as we pulled out of the campsite, the same vehicle appeared again, turning into our sight. When they saw us leaving, they immediately started following us. Now, the roads in Wyoming's wilderness are bumpy and poorly maintained, and the area is known for wildlife, large animals that often wander onto the road. The thought of that SUV trailing us through such an isolated area made my heart race. My husband turned to me and said, "I have to go fast. Are you okay with that?" I didn't hesitate, answering, "Just go. Get us out of here." We floored it. We were easily going 80 miles per hour down those winding roads, through the canyon, trying to escape. The SUV stayed on our tail for about 10 minutes, but after we passed through the canyon, we lost them. It was the most terrifying experience of our lives. We still think about it to this day and wonder what might have happened if we hadn't trusted our instincts and left when we did. I was camping during a derecho, the one that swept through West Virginia. For those who may not know, a derecho is a powerful, fast-moving storm system that brings a wall of intense wind capable of ripping up trees, overturning small buildings, and causing widespread chaos. It sounds like something out of a movie, but when you're in the middle of a forest, surrounded by towering trees, it feels like a nightmare come to life. That's exactly what I found myself in the midst of one fateful night, trapped alone in a forest as the winds howled and trees began to snap like twigs. But oddly enough, the storm itself wasn't the most terrifying part of the night. You see, I had set up my tent in a single-walled pavilion, thinking it would offer some protection from the elements. The heavy winds and flying debris were unsettling, but I felt mostly shielded from the worst of it. What I didn't account for was that I wasn't the only one seeking shelter there that night. As the storm raged on, the sound of tree limbs snapping and wind ripping through the forest was drowned out by something far more terrifying: the rhythmic sound of claws tapping against the cement foundation beneath me. At first, I didn't understand what I was hearing. It wasn't until I heard the low, guttural huffing of something large, moving with a determined pace, that I realized the truth. A bear, a massive black bear, had found refuge in the very same pavilion, and it wasn't happy about it. Now I've had my fair share of encounters with bears while camping. It's usually a little unnerving, sure, but with enough noise and some well-timed gestures, they typically retreat. This time, though, was different. The bear wasn't just passing by, it was clearly agitated, pacing around my tent, making it impossible to ignore. I could hear the tap, tap, tap of its claws against the cement slab with every heavy stride it took. Its claws scraped the ground like nails on a chalkboard, and its breathing grew louder, more erratic, punctuated by angry huffs as it ran circles around me. But the storm outside only seemed to add to the nightmare. Gale-force winds tore through the trees, causing the forest to groan and crack, while the bear continued its frantic movements. I could hear it running away from the pavilion for a few seconds, as if it were considering leaving. But then, almost immediately, it would return, running in frantic circles again, angrier each time, as though the storm and the fear it stirred inside it only made it more dangerous. The pavilion, which should have been my safe haven, now felt like a suffocating cage with no escape. For what felt like hours, I sat in the darkness, my only companions the terrifying sound of the bear's claws and the storm ripping apart the forest around me. I could only hope that the storm would pass quickly, but it seemed like the wind wasn't going to let up anytime soon. In the midst of the madness, I realized there was no easy way out. My mind raced, and the only thing I could think to do was prepare for the worst. My hunting knife, which I kept within reach for moments just like this, was taped to my hand with duct tape, just in case. The bear's angry pacing continued, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was more terrified than I was. After all, it wasn't just me it had to contend with. It had the storm to deal with as well. But that didn't bring me any comfort. The bear wasn't scared enough to leave the pavilion, and I wasn't sure what it would do if it decided to get too close. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My heart was pounding in my chest, each breath shallow and quick. I couldn't make a sound, couldn't move, just waited, hoping that the bear would lose interest or the storm would pass, leaving me in peace. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the bear's pacing slowed. It ventured off into the night, likely lured by the darkness or the stillness that followed the storm's fury. I waited a few moments longer, just to be sure, before I cautiously unwrapped the duct tape from my hand. I had survived the night, but I would never forget the terror of hearing that bear's claws tapping relentlessly against the ground. Its anger, its confusion, and the crushing realization that I had no control over what could have happened. That night, remains one of the scariest experiences of my life. And to this day, it's one of the only times I've ever felt completely helpless in the presence of a bear. The storm, the bear, and the isolated setting created a perfect storm of fear, a memory I'll never escape. I'll share a first-hand experience from a camping trip I had a couple of summers ago in Sequoia National Forest, on top of Slate Mountain, back in August 2019. My partner, another couple, and I were camping on our family's lot. There were only 4 of us, and we didn't see a single person on the mountain that day. That night, the darkness felt almost suffocating. There was no artificial light except for a small potbelly stove that we kept going for heat. The pier fire had ravaged the area just a couple of years earlier, and we didn't want to risk starting another fire with no cell service nearby. We were sitting around the fire, chatting and enjoying the quiet of the mountainside, when something strange happened. It was around 10 p.m. or 10:30 p.m. My 2 dogs, who were comfortably lying at my feet, suddenly sat up. They shifted their weight and postured as if they were on alert, backs stiff, noses twitching as they sniffed the air. They didn't whine or growl like they usually did when a bear was nearby at other campsites, but their sudden change in behavior was unsettling. At the same time, a strange silence settled over us. The conversation came to an abrupt halt. Then, we all heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But not just any footsteps. These were heavy, deliberate steps, moving quickly and steadily up the steep slope of the mountain, directly near our campsite. The area near our tent deck was thick with trees and covered in layers of fallen leaves, making the forest floor slippery and treacherous. During the day, we had intentionally avoided that area because of how unstable and dangerous it was. But now, someone, or something, was climbing that very slope with ease, moving far too quickly for the terrain. The sound of the footsteps didn't seem like the usual rhythm of an animal, like a deer or even a bear. These footsteps were different, heavier, and unmistakably bipedal. They were the kind of steps a human, or something resembling a human, would make. But who would be out there, climbing the mountain at that hour? And in the dark, all of us froze. We exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of it. There was an odd tension in the air, and it was like the forest itself had gone eerily still. None of us could shake the feeling that something wasn't right. In an attempt to ward off whatever was creeping around our camp, we decided to fire up the generator, hoping the noise would make it go away. We didn't know if it would work, but the sense of unease was too much to ignore. Now, I've been camping for years. I've spent countless nights in the wild, and usually nothing gets under my skin. Sure, I've had some close calls, like the time a bear tried to get into my car for a cooler, or when I stumbled across a mountain lion on a hike, but this felt different. It wasn't the kind of fear I was used to. It was something more primal, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The animals had a sixth sense for danger, and whatever we heard that night, whatever was moving around us, had no business being there. We never figured out what caused the footsteps, but all 4 of us, my partner, the other couple, and I, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. That experience stayed with me, lingering in my mind long after the trip ended. Even now, whenever I find myself in the woods, that night echoes in the back of my mind, reminding me that there are things in the dark that we may never truly understand. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. But be careful, because sometimes the things we fear in stories have a way of finding us in real life.